Welcome everyone, I'm glad to see you, and we have looked very forward to this evening, and we hope that Satya Tanner will inspire us at least for one whole hour. After the presentation, it will be possible to get a talk to the one sitting next to you and have a little sandwich and something to drink. For those of you who do not know Hypatia, there's a little folder, a flyer on your chair where you can read about Hypatia, and we encourage everyone to join us to become a member of Hypatia so we can invite you to our coming events. It's free to join the events and also free to be a member. Our next event is our yearly speed mentoring event where we invite successful female engineers from different companies, for example Maersk and Novo Nordisk, IBM, Coloplast, and so on. Before I give the word to Lise, I will shortly say that DTU Alumni is our sponsor for tonight, and they do have interesting event as well. There's a little flyer on the chair where you can read more about alumni and their events. So Lise, I will give the word to you.
Hi. So I'm not going to introduce Satya because we thought that you are going to do it much better. You know your career better than us. So I'm just saying that we are very glad that she's here tonight and at DTU. And she has been, for instance, speaking in front of Google in the headquarters to inspire women in engineering. And now it's for you. So thank you.
I don't need that one. Can everybody hear me? Oh yes, I'm very loud. So first of all, thank you ladies, and thank you for allowing me to be here tonight to speak to you all. You know, a little brief introduction to my career. I joined the Royal Australian Air Force when I was 17, and I did an engineering degree at the Defence Force Academy that they have there in Canberra. And when I was in my 4th year, I decided, you know what, I think I'd like to try being a pilot, because no one had ever really broached that subject with me when I was in recruiting. It just was something that I never really even considered was something that women can do, in the same way that I guess many women or young girls don't necessarily consider engineering, you know, an option for them as well. And anyway, so I gave that a go and was actually successful in the application process, and then spent the next 2 years training to be a pilot. I passed the course and then flew C-130s for 1 year. And at the end of that time, I was involved in the Bali bombing aeromedical evacuations. And that was a fairly transformative period for me, because we were on the tarmac, and in this one particular instance, we were on the tarmac and there was 3 really badly burnt Indonesians that we were waiting to take back to Australia, and there was this one girl that they were trying to resuscitate and stabilise for about 2 hours. And the father, she had like 70% burns to her body. It wasn't looking good at all. And the father was off to the side, and he was like beside himself with grief and what's going to happen. And in that moment, I realized, you know, it's really important to be doing what you're doing, what you want to be doing with all your heart as much as you can, because life really is short, and you never know, you know, when it's going to be taken from you in some way. And when I checked in with myself, I realized at that point in time, you know, flying is fun, but actually I'd rather be doing engineering. So I went completely against the grain. About a month later, I approached my commanding officer and said, I'd like to go back to engineering. And the way that I couched it, which was as a solution to some problems that he was having, meant that he actually supported me all the way, which was fantastic. Because to get into an inner sanctum like a group of military pilots and then back your way out of it is not something that most people do. Anyway, I spent the rest of my career working as an engineer for the Royal Australian Air Force, and then a couple of years ago I moved to the US and worked in the manufacturing, aerospace manufacturing sector there, and now I'm here. So anyway, what I wanted to say was, you know, when I was 17 and I was at the Defence Academy, it suddenly dawned on me that in less than 4 years' time, I'm going to be leading a bunch of mostly men who are mostly double my age, and I'm terrified about that prospect, absolutely terrified, even though having gone through my entire recruiting process, of course, you know, talk about your leadership aptitude and this and that and blah, blah, blah. And actually, you know, looking back, clearly it wasn't a problem for me in the end, but this aspect for women is actually not that uncommon in my experience talking to other women, and there are also studies that have also shown this as well. Women tend to not have confidence in their abilities until they've proven it to themselves. And I say tend to because not all women are this way. Similarly, men tend to have confidence in their abilities before they've proven it to themselves in some way. So there are pros and cons to both of these approaches. I mean, you know, the women's traditional way tends to mean you may be underconfident about yourself, although I like to just consider it evidence-based competency. The men's traditional way of doing it, you know, is certainly good for when you're taking a risk in some way, but then at the same time it can also be overconfidence or wishful thinking. So really what it comes down to, I think, is having enough knowledge of yourself to know, you know, where your capabilities lie and what you think you're probably capable of, even if you haven't done it before. So on that note, I thought it was very important to talk to you today about leadership. Having been in the military, leadership was something that was very big for me. It wasn't just about being an engineer, it was also very much about being an officer. So leadership formed such a huge component of that. And because of my own terror around leadership, despite having got through all the obstacles to get into the Defence Academy in the first place, I felt that it was an appropriate topic to talk to all of you about as well. So there's 3 key areas that I want to discuss today. The first one is being mindful of your worldview and how that impacts you in a leadership sense. The second one I'm going to talk to you about is some of the barriers that exist in relation to actually not just women, but also anything related to diversity. And the third thing I'm going to talk to you about is the need to have tools that help you understand culture and why that's important in leadership. So the first point, worldview. You may not know it, but going through university and doing an engineering degree means that you come out the other end of the pipeline with a very specific way of looking at the world. And so this is what I mean when I say worldview. As engineers, we tend to see the world in black and white. Why? Because we need to. You know, you can't do an engineering calculation if you haven't made some assumptions about things, and you know, we kind of create little boxes and put them together and create a nice package, and this is how we're going to make a decision, yeah? That's the nature of it. If we don't do that, then there is no engineering, and it's all very wafty and airy-fairy, very hard to make decisions. The problem is that in a leadership capacity, this worldview can limit you. And I want to tell you a story that probably expresses this better than, you know, any other lecture that anyone could possibly give you on this. And that is that one of my first leadership roles, I walked into the job, and on the first day, the guy who was a bit like my right-hand man, equivalent to, say, a foreman, he was a warrant officer. So, you know, he'd been through, like, he'd been in the Defence Force for, I think, more than 20 years, and he'd been to the pinnacle of his career. And first day on the job, because I knew him, and I said, so tell me, how are you enjoying the new job? And he says, to be honest, ma'am, I dread getting out of bed to come to work every day. And I thought, that's not a problem you can solve with a calculator. So, that just, I hope, gives you a bit of an idea of why this worldview, this very reductionist engineering worldview, has its limitations. So at that point, you have to swap into something that can actually see the shades of grey and black and white that are out there in real life. So anyway, what I did is over the next course of maybe 3 to 6 months, I worked with him and I said, okay, so, well, tell me, what is it you want to do with your life? Not just what do you want to do in the job, but what do you actually want to do with your life, and how can we use your career to get you to the next place that you want to go in life? He, of course, didn't know the answer to that straight away. I mean, who does? But over the course of, as I said, the next 3 to 6 months, we had dialogues around this topic and helped him to get some clarity on, this is what I want to do. I want to get an overseas posting and, develop myself in this way and that way. And so I did a deal with him and I said, okay, well, I'll let you do all of the training courses that will make you competitive for this particular role if you make sure that all the work is done. And he said, okay, it's a deal. And so by the end of that 6 months, the outcome was, by the end of another 18 months, he got the job that he wanted. He was happy for the entire 18 months, not because the work was interesting, but just because he was, the people were interesting that we were working with, and we created an environment that was fun and enjoyable to come to work. And at the end of that time, I also got some 360-degree feedback from him, and on my own leadership abilities and performance. And he said, well, you're the first female boss that I've ever had, and actually, you're the best boss that I've ever had. And I was like, wow. But the thing with officers versus non-commissioned officers is they'll never live you up on a pedestal, similar to technicians versus engineers. He said, but you're not perfect. So made sure I popped to the ego bubble there. Anyway, so I hope that story, just gives you a bit of insight that your worldview, the way that you see the world, particularly as the engineering degree has trained you to see the world, is great for engineering decisions, but you need to check it at the door when it comes to leading people. It's important that you look at a whole-of-person approach. It's not just, and even more than the engineering worldview, I'd even say the capitalist worldview of you're just a person and you're just a human resource who's here to work and I'm going to pay you for your labour and you're going to do the work. That also doesn't work. If you think of any great leaders that you know, they all took interest in who you are as a person, not just what you do and how much you get paid and these sorts of things. So always try and think larger than the scope itself. Think of the whole person and their whole life. So the next point I wanted to talk to you about is some of the barriers and things like that women can face, and not just women, but particularly women in engineering, because this is the context, in organisations. Being female engineers, and given that when you look at the statistics and the numbers, we are definitely the minority out there, it implies that no matter where you go, you're going to be a pioneer of some sort. Unless, like me, you happened to at one point of time work in an engineering office where there was one guy and 4 women, and boy did he get an education that year. But that was an anomaly. Nonetheless, so there's four key things that I want to talk to you about, because when you look at history and you look at the fight that women have made for having equal opportunity and to bring about gender balance in society in various ways, some of the biggest opponents to that have actually been other women. You look at the suffragette movement when they tried to, allow women to have the vote in many Western countries. Typically, if you look back in history, most of the biggest opponents were actually women themselves. So if you want to be a good leader, you want to be on the right side of history. So I want to tell you a couple of key ideas that are going to help you ensure that you're on the right side of history when these sorts of things are looked back on in years to come. So the first one is something called homosocial reproduction. And what that means is like tends to promote like, which is one of the reasons why if you look around at many companies, you'll tend to notice, I mean, it depends on the context, but in the Western world, you'll tend to notice that the top management is dominated by white, middle-aged men. Yeah? And homosocial reproduction is something that can actually explain why this happens. What it means is, as you move up through the management ranks, or as you go from a job that's, say, very specific. If you're, for example, putting together widgets on a manufacturing floor, not that any of you would, because that's not the nature of your role, but that kind of role is quite defined. There's not much scope for making your own decisions in that kind of role. And then as you move up through the management ranks, say through to become a professional engineer and so forth, you have more scope for decision making. And then as you go further up, things become more and more ambiguous. And so there becomes an issue of trust. And so what people tend to do unconsciously is that they will promote other people who are similar to themselves. They think in the same way, they look the same way, that type of thing. Case in point, this was a previous organisation that I worked for. Someone came into the organisation. I was working in a project management role. Someone came into the organisation, and they were maybe like 2 days onto the job, and mentioned that during their interview, the management staff had implied that he had great potential to rise the ranks and move into the general manager equivalent roles very quickly. And I remember thinking, well, that's a bit unfair. They never said that to me, and I've got probably a lot more project management experience than this guy. What the heck is all that about? But when I looked at it after a month of getting to know him, and he was a good guy, like, don't get me wrong, I realised he was a bit of a template of all the other guys that were already in management. Someone that they automatically trust. Like, how is it that during just even the interview they have a sense that he's going to make it into management? It's because he looks like them. Their offspring in some way. So anyway, that's an example of homosocial reproduction. And that is why when things like quotas come about, actually they're not a bad thing. I know in some level, we might think, oh my God, quotas, I'm going to be the token female, this, that, the other. No, just take it. Take the opportunity, ladies, because it might be the only thing that gets you through that homosocial reproduction thing that's going on. There's pros and cons to everything, but many people don't understand that there's this underlying dynamic going on that really prevents people, and it's not just gender, it can be race, religion, ageism, a whole bunch of other things that this relates to. So that's why quotas are necessary, and be very careful about shooting down quotas. So another idea that I want to introduce you to is based on discrimination. A lot of people don't necessarily understand the chain of events that lead to discrimination. So first of all, you have a stereotype, and I'm sure most people in the room understand what a stereotype is. You basically just say that entire group of people, tend to have this trait, so now everybody who belongs to that group has that trait. That then leads to prejudice. So let me give you a concrete example. Pregnant women sometimes get pregnancy brain. So the stereotype could be all pregnant women have pregnancy brain. Have you heard of pregnancy brain before? Okay, good, just checking. So then the prejudgment might come in where it's like, oh, there's a pregnant woman. She's got pregnancy brain for sure. Yeah? Then what happens is the next step is when it comes to discrimination. And that's where it might be, I'm not going to offer her a job because she's got pregnancy brain and she's not going to be able to do the job well. So this is like the chain of events. it's kind of somewhat natural for human beings to categorize people and things because it's one of the ways that we make sense of the world. But we always have to remember that each individual has their own story and their own journey, and they may break the mold, and we always have to be open to that. So sure, categorization is fine, but stereotyping is where it becomes problematic. I'm going to tell you a story about, it didn't lead to discrimination, but it was definitely stereotyping and prejudgment that happened to me when I was in my early 20s. So it was during the year that I was flying C-130s. They sent me to an exercise with the Army. So it was an Army and Air Force exercise, and I was working in the Air Operations Centre and on the operations desk, which basically just means helping to plan the flights and missions and where they need to go and when, and do we have enough aircraft and people and that kind of thing. Anyway, I was just sitting there minding my own business. My boss was off somewhere else, and so I was there at the operations desk all by myself. And the Army General and his entourage decided to come past and pay a little visit. I thought, okay, this is going to be interesting, and you'll find out why. Anyway, so he came up to me and he said, flying officer, so what do you do? And I said, oh, I'm working on the operations desk, sir. And he said, oh, well, what do you do normally? And I said, oh, I'm a pilot, sir. Oh, a pilot? Oh, well, what do you fly? I said, I fly C-130s, sir. And he said, whoa, how does a little thing like you fly a big thing like that? To which I replied with a deadpan face, hydraulics, sir. He didn't know what to do with himself. He started digging a hole, and so then he said, what I mean was, my daughter, she's in the Army, and she drives big Mog trucks, and sometimes I just think, wow, that's just amazing, you know, that she can drive these big trucks. And I'm thinking, really? Like, come on, like, men can drive them like women can't? Are you serious? I didn't say that, of course. Would have got done for insubordination. But anyway, I wanted to share that story with, eventually he left out of embarrassment, but I wanted to share that story with you because it's probably a common story for many women. It doesn't necessarily always lead to discrimination, but definitely the stereotyping and the prejudice are fairly common experiences. I want to just also deconstruct a little bit of my response, and in case that helps you in some way. So I once did this course run by the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Australia, which I know sounds really odd that an engineer should be doing something around dramatic art, but it was called Women in Business, and it was all about how to use things like facial expressions and your voice to command attention and authority and various other things like that. Anyway, so one of the things that we were taught was a tool called neutral regard. So this is one of those situations whereby you might be sitting, you know, in maybe a boardroom situation, and someone is just talking away like this, and maybe you're bored, so you sit there bored, and they can see that you're bored, so then they start ignoring you. Or alternatively, you're sitting there really attentively, and they may be looking at you in such a way that sort of says, I've got the power because I'm talking and you're looking at me. You know, this is sort of a common dynamic that can go on. What I did in the situation with the general, and which can work in any of these other situations where there's these sort of funky power dynamics that can go on, is this thing called neutral regard. What you do is you take your face and you completely relax it, and then you kind of curl up the edges just a little bit, and then no one has any idea what you're thinking. And it really makes them unsettled, which is what I basically did to the general. Actually, incidentally, I did that before I even knew what neutral regard was, but I just wanted to let you know that that's another tool that you can use. Now, sometimes you go into it, this was also explained to me during this particular course that I did. You know, you go into someone's office, typically it's a man, sitting back like this on the chair, you know, having a good old relax, and it's not very professional. Anyway, so you walk in and your response might sort of be, oh, that's a bit much, you know, oh. But actually there's something unconscious about that dynamic, which is sort of like, yes, I've got the power, or as it was described to us word for word, look at the package is the underlying prehistoric brain that's talking in that kind of situation. So it was explained to us in this sort of situation, classic way to use neutral regard. You walk in, look at the package, you just turn around and do this. So anyway, I was wondering about that file with such and such, and they suddenly feel like an idiot and go, oh, and start doing things properly. So that's basically what happened, you know, with this general. You'd have to practice in the mirror, otherwise you might just have some weird-looking smirk on your face. So anyway, that's neutral regard for you. Okay, so something else I wanted to talk to you about is the idea of subordinated cooperation versus coordinated cooperation. So one of the problems I think that many women face, or that feminism as a movement faces, is because it's tied up to gendered language, it automatically implies a whole bunch of things about the power relationships that aren't necessarily true. For example, a lot of people seem to think that feminism is about women dominating the earth, where actually that's not its agenda in the majority of cases. It's, mainstream feminism is about gender balance. And so what I propose is that you can deconstruct some of these, or you can get sidestep some of these complications by using terms such as subordinated cooperation versus coordinated cooperation. Subordinated cooperation is where you have like a master-slave relationship. So it's all about the power dynamics, yeah? I'm holier than thou, this type of thing. Whereas coordinated cooperation is, we are equals on some level. You may not be equals in the hierarchy. You may not be equals in age. You may not be equals in, a whole bunch of things, but you come together with your diversity, with mutual respect to work together on whatever problem it is that you happen to be working on. So that is where, that's the essence of coordinated cooperation. Not trying to make everybody the same. It's not that a woman going into a male-dominated environment has to become a man. No, you can stay being a woman in whatever way being a woman means to you, because that differs for everybody, and work alongside other people with all their different differences as well. This brings about also, there's one other sub-point to this too that I wanted to raise, and there's this notion of something called intersectionality, and it's this idea that, okay, so you may all be, or mostly, women engineers, but then there's other areas that kind of intersect. If you have a different religion to the mainstream religion, if you come from a different racial background, it can mean that, for example, in the US, if you're a black woman, you get a double whammy of what they call inequality regimes. And so your experience is going to be quite different to the next person. Because each individual human being is different anyway, then clearly this is going to be the case no matter what. But inequality regimes are something that exists basically everywhere. And the subordinated cooperation is something, and versus coordinated cooperation frame is something that I find useful to detect some of these at some times as well. To give you an example, or to kind of unpack the idea of inequality regimes a little more, what you'll find is within a given context, it's usually been set up for a particular group of people. For example, when I did my flying training, it was really geared around young, single, white men who drank alcohol and, a bunch of other things within that context. So if you were a married man or woman, if you were a woman, if you didn't drink alcohol, if you were a lot older than the rest of the group, in some ways, the course, was more of a struggle for you. It wasn't really geared around your needs, okay? So the privileged group there were the young, white, single men. For anyone who's not the privileged group, on some level, by default, that means you're experiencing an inequality regime. It's actually really hard to create any environment without an inequality regime, but that doesn't mean that, that it absolves us of the responsibility to try and continue making things more equal all the time as these things become apparent to us, because that's basic human rights, actually. So, okay, so that was inequality regimes. I wanted to just tell you one other story, related to the idea of, women and inequality regimes, this type of thing. Another thing that you might face, I think, is ageism. It's something that me and some of my peers have also faced. Being a young woman is a bit like a double whammy when it comes to inequality in certain contexts. So one of my friends, she's not an engineer, but she does work in a male-dominated environment. She has a pair of what she calls credibility glasses. This is where she has a pair of glasses that have just a regular glass in them. They don't magnify anything. And so she'll be sitting in like a meeting room environment, and she's got some authority, within the organisation. But that doesn't mean that people who are equal to her or lower to her don't try to stamp on her authority in various ways. So what she devised is this situation whereby something like the following might happen. The men might say, "Oh, so tell us what you think of that one." And rather than just saying, "Oh yes, I think that's good," and then they kind of off they go, what she does is she pulls out her credibility glasses. She puts them on. She says, "Oh, which one is it again? Oh, it's that one. Oh, yes, let's do that. I agree with that one." And she puts them back down. It's amazing. They all look at her completely different just as a result of putting a pair of glasses on, which is obviously an indication that there's a whole bunch of prejudice going on and, all these other things. And I'm certainly not advocating that credibility glasses are going to change the underlying systems, but you may find in your careers and in your journey that in order to get into a position of authority whereby you can actually change the system, you might have to defer to some tactics similar to that. Okay, so so that's a little bit about some of the concepts that will help you to identify how to be on the correct side of history. I just also wanted to mention that in terms of ways that people address this, most of the things that I've mentioned so far have just been really superficial. None of those things are actually going to change the system in any way. And so what you'll also tend to find if you work for a company that has, good solid HR practices and procedures is there will tend to be 3, maybe 4 types of policies that you'll see in play. One of those is called temporal policies, and that's where what they do is focus on the deficiency within the person. Okay, our women don't have enough assertiveness. Let's give them more assertiveness and aggression training or something like that. That's obviously got its limitations because they're not necessarily thinking, well, how about we give the men some more cooperation training? So that can be problematic because it's still not deconstructing the underlying paradigm of subordinated cooperation, if there is one. The other type of policy that you'll find is role-related. So organisations have been set up pretty much based around the traditional family model whereby the man goes to work and the woman stays at home and looks after the kids. And then we've had to have all of these add-on policies to kind of make it a little bit more fair since then, which is why you now have a lot of family-friendly policies that weren't available 50 years ago, let's say. Flexible working hours, maternity leave that can be shared between both parents, these sorts of things. They never used to be there in the way that they are today. So that's the other type of policy that you'll see, and that doesn't benefit. And you'll also notice, I just want to make a point that these policies that are usually geared towards women and their needs actually have the effect of really helping men too, because in men's culture there tends to be a pecking order. And for most men, which is the bottom half, that's not a very fun place to be. And so when a lot of these policies and change management practices come in that are kind of trying to make things more equal, the bottom half quite like it. So the third type of policy that you'll see is, based on legislation typically, and it's usually to do with anti-discrimination. How do we make sure that we're recruiting people in a way that doesn't, mean that we're discriminating against them? All right, so I want to go on to my final point now, which was to do with culture and understanding culture. So for me, I found a tool that, came across a tool that I really like, and I'd like to share that with you because I think it's a really nice way of understanding situations. And it's called Causal Layered Analysis, and it was developed by Suhail and Ayatollah. And if you do a Google search on Causal Layered Analysis and TEDx, you'll find a 20-minute video on YouTube where he explains it in a lot more depth than I'm going to explain to you today. But nonetheless, here's how it basically goes. So you have, at the top level, you have the litany. So it's like the visible aspects of any problem. For example, when I was doing my pilot training, there was really high failure rates, and the students were really stressed out all the time. So for example, we actually started with 33 people on my course, and we only graduated 12. If you then go deeper, you might look at what are the systemic reasons for why that is the case. And it's everything from, there's not enough instructors and there's too many students, so they can't give the appropriate amount of time. There's all these sort of social system reasons underneath that are contributing to those high failure rates and so forth. A lot of people know about these two layers on some sort of intuitive level anyway, but it's the next two layers that are actually the most important. So the next layer down is the worldview. And I've already discussed a little bit of worldview. In this particular example, when I was doing my military training, the military elite worldview was very, very predominant. So, and the military elite worldview was about the inner sanctum, the inner circle, right? So it's based on subordinated cooperation. So that then creates almost an incubator for stress and all of these other types of things. Underneath the worldview, the final layer, which is actually the most powerful layer if you want to actually engage in change, is narrative. And so at that level, when you looked at it, most people had this feeling like it was as though to be a pilot is to be God, or pilot is God. It's the only thing you'd ever want to do in your life, and to be anything else is a complete failure of your existence. That's how it felt. So no wonder all the students were stressed out and we had really high failure rates and, all that kind of stuff. You can change the systems to your heart's content, but really, until you really address that underlying narrative, the rest of it's not going to shift. So there's a couple of applications for this with respect to leadership. First of all, in terms of the self, I like to work at the narrative level as much as possible. The rest of it's fairly straightforward to change. It's not that hard to change a system. It's not that hard to put a band-aid solution on something at the level of litany. Worldview is a little bit challenging to change, but it's usually around language and the way that you use language. But at the level of narrative, first of all, you need to become conscious of what your narrative is. So on an individual level, at one point, a few years back, I realised that I had an inner narrative that said, I have to be Superwoman. That's problematic because you get very sick when you're having to say yes to everything and do everything for everyone all the time. It's a noble narrative to have, no doubt about it, but there comes a point where you might find yourself in a double bind and it's just not working for you anymore. And so at that point, what I had to do was transform the narrative. And the best way to transform the narrative is to somehow stay within the original frame. So after some discussions with some friends, I realized that my new narrative was going to be a la carte Superwoman. I get to pick and choose exactly when I'm Superwoman. And the nice thing about that is it meant that I gave myself permission to say no, because I wasn't giving up on this unconscious archetype. It was still there, but I could just access it when I wanted to access it, rather than having to say yes to absolutely everything and overcommitting myself. Anyway, so that's narrative on a very individual level. With respect to leadership, I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened, with in a previous organisation. This particular person that I was working with was not a direct subordinate of mine, because I was working in a matrix organisation, so actually I didn't have any direct subordinates as a project manager. But I had to work very closely with him, and he would have to take some level of direction from me. So the situation was as follows. He had applied for my job and not got it. And so when I showed up, being some 30 years-ish younger than him, I was a huge threat on a whole bunch of levels for him, no doubt. But I didn't know this when I arrived. All that I knew was that he would try to throw me under the bus 3 times a week in front of the executives, either through email or verbally in front of them, just try and make me look bad in some way. It was quite a challenging ordeal, to say the least. Anyway, so I tried a couple of things. First of all, I just tried being nice to him. That didn't work. Okay, what am I going to do? And then someone mentioned to me, you know what? Send love to him. I said, what? No, try it. Just send love to him. And I thought, okay. Anyway, so what I did, he'd be completely revolting to me in some way. And so I would just mentally stop and just try and send love to him, whenever these sorts of things happened. I swear to God that after a couple of weeks, it went from 3 times a week under the bus to once a week under the bus. Because obviously when you're coming from that frame, it changes your reaction, your response, a whole bunch of things like that. And things kind of slide off you a whole bunch easier. But what I think really helped shift it for me was the narrative. So what I did is, initially I'd seen him like this bear that was trying to attack me all the time and, eat me. And I'm thinking, okay, I've got to change this narrative, because he just feels really ferocious. But that's, the more I think of him in that way, the more it's going to reinforce that behavior somehow. So anyway, what I did is I decided to picture him as a bear in a cage, like one of those bears that, got locked up with the circus, and the kids came along and poked him with sticks when he was young. And now anyone who walks past the cage, he's like, raw, even if you haven't done anything, which was, my situation. And so when I switched my frame and I saw him like that, it allowed me to feel compassion for him in a whole different way that I hadn't been able to feel compassion before. Don't get me wrong, it was incredibly challenging working with this guy, but it meant that I could cope with the situation a whole bunch better without having to, completely pull the plug on my job and go somewhere else. So anyway, so that's the power of narrative on that personal, in that personal leadership sense. There's also, with narrative, the other great thing about narrative is it's also very useful from a change management point of view. So if you've got an organisation that's got a culture of, I don't know, do you guys know the show Bob the Builder? Yeah, okay. So most engineers, when you speak to them, underneath it all, that's their narrative, is Bob the Builder. And, that's great, because, we all like to help out and fix things and whatnot. But it's also got limitations, in certain contexts. So, there are times when you may find that the Bob the Builder can-do attitude means that you're completely run ragged in ways that are quite unnecessary. And so you might have to shift that narrative in some way. Having said that, from a leadership standpoint, if your staff all have that narrative and you decide, oh, I've got this great brand new strategy, we're going to do all these, really left brain things and blah, blah, blah. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. If the culture is like Bob the Builder and you're trying to bring in all these new innovative things that are way outside the story of Bob the Builder, it is not going to work at all. So you either need to do something around like the way that you tell stories about, I don't know, maybe Bob the Builder goes to an innovation class, or whatever it may be. There's some way that you need to change the vision through storytelling, which not children's book storytelling, but just the way that you use language and keep saying the vision over and over until they say it back to you, basically. But you've always got to be mindful of this narrative situation. It's the identity. Similarly, if you're working in a really bureaucratic organisation that prides itself on being slow and steady, you can't suddenly come in with a bunch of strategies about being fast and quick, because it's like the tortoise becomes the hare, and that's too much of a transformation for people. There are ways to do it, as I mentioned, but you have to sort of baby steps. Somehow the tortoise needs to transform into a hare, and that's not an easy process. So you've got to keep that in mind when you're in these sorts of situations. All right, so that sums up the three main points that I wanted to talk to you about. So it's be mindful of your worldview. Also, make sure that you become a pioneer and you stay on the correct side of history moving forward into the future. And then finally, get yourself some tools such as causal analysis or other things that help you really understand the culture, because underneath it all, we're going to be working with people, and culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So if you want to get things done, that's absolutely imperative. So I'd like to thank you all for coming here tonight to listen to me, and just plug for my website. I do have a blog, so if you want to follow my blog, you can go to the website and join the Burn feeder there. I'm also going to be in Denmark for another week or two, and I'll be back again late November. So if you would like me to come to speak at your organisation or to other groups, please just contact me through the website. Thank you.
Hello? Okay, it's working now. Okay. Thank you so much, Satya. Sorry. Yeah. I would like to ask you the first questions. I wonder, you have a long career, and if you should pick one decision that you have made that has changed everything, or that has been important for you, which one would you choose?
Yeah. Okay. Let me think. I would say that probably the most important decision that I made was the one where I decided to change back to engineering, because on some intuitive level I knew that as much as flying was fun, it wasn't where I needed to be, and it was a really hard decision to make, and it required a lot of courage because of the culture and the way that I was really going against the grain for that. But what it meant is it set a precedence for me in terms of really taking charge of my own life and doing what I really wanted to do deep down. So.
Thank you. Other questions?
Hi, my name is Catherine, and it seems like during your career that you have had the approach that when you enter a situation, if it doesn't work for you, then you are the one that adapts to it. Is that correct, or has there been a situation where?
Well, bearing in mind that I was in the military, so I only had limited choice. I couldn't just give up my job and go somewhere else. In many instances, I had to adapt, or I had to make it work in some way. So thankfully, being in a position of leadership meant that I had the ability to change the culture within my scope, that was underneath me. And so that's something that I've always done, no matter where I go. I can only do so much about managing upwards. I do that to the best of my ability. Just try and get them thinking in a slightly different way, but there's limitations. The great thing about the military, though, is that you only have to wait 1 or 2 years and they're gone. So then the next one comes in and then you train them up. So Yeah, that was in essence, you know, my experience, but more due to a function of the system.
Hi.
Hi.
In the beginning, you said that when you started as a manager, you it seems to me that you didn't really think about the fact that you were younger and that your gender was female, opposed to a lot of your colleagues. From my experience, I've never been a manager, but as a colleague, I always think that being a female in a male-dominated world, it helps if you don't think about the gender.
Yeah,
But
it's
then,
interesting.
Then later on, you told strategies to, for example, with the glasses and stuff. What do you feel about that? Do you feel that it's good to think about the fact that your gender is female, or is it best to just leave it?
Gotcha. Now, that's a really good point. When I wake up in the morning, I don't go, oh, I'm Satya and I'm a woman, right? No one does. But there may come situations where you just have to be aware of what is working for equality or social equality and what is working for diversity. Because, you know, diversity is what is really important for companies. The more diversity there is, the better their performance. That's the business case argument. But then there's also just the human justice side of it is we need to get rid of these systems which are making it, you know, difficult for others. So that doesn't mean you walk around going, stamping your I'm a female engineer on absolutely everything you do, because that's just going to make people annoyed. But you just keep in the back of your mind if, okay, you know, and it's not just about gender, it's about a whole bunch of things. It's about being mindful that it might be disability, it might be age, it might be religion, it might be a whole bunch of other things. What am I doing to help make this situation accessible for everybody? Does that make sense? And from a leadership standpoint, that's the mentality that you want to bring into it. When you're not in a leadership position, it's more just, okay, noticing, well, what are the structures around here that are working against people? There's always going to be something, you know, so just start to build your intelligence, you know, in that sense, so that you can become aware of it, so that when you get into a position where you can change it, that you can change it because you can identify it in the first place. But you're dead right. Don't walk, you know, you don't walk around putting your stamp of I'm a woman engineer and everything, because really we're all people and we're all diverse and we're all different. But if you're ever in a situation where everyone's trying to pretend you're all the same, call it out. That's also not true. It's about appreciating the diversity that we all have.
Hi. Have you always been a manager within aerospace engineering?
Yeah, more or less, because, you know, my background as an aerospace engineer in the Defence Force, that was the case. But, well, that was my title. But, I mean, I did a whole bunch of jobs. I also worked in recruiting where I didn't have anyone directly working for me. I was recruiting other engineers. So that was the engineering sort of side to it. Another job, I worked as a trainer. I was training staff from overseas militaries in Australian culture and military culture, which had absolutely nothing to do with engineering. But from a military officer standpoint, they wanted us to have that experience in order to develop ourselves and our leadership potential.
Did you find it easy to be a manager outside your specialization?
Yes, because you know, it's all the same sort of principles, really. I mean, I found, because some people think that to be a manager you need to be the subject matter expert. I wholeheartedly disagree, and that's one of the reasons why this warrant officer, I think, enjoyed having me as a boss, is because I knew that I wasn't the subject matter expert. I had the big picture, but he was the subject matter expert, and the other staff were the subject matter experts. So I would go to them to get more details. When I worked as a trainer, I wasn't specifically in a management role, but I've worked even outside of, you know, defence. I've done a lot of volunteer work with event management, organising yoga retreats and things that are completely not related to the military. But it's the same principles. Basically, just treat people with respect. You know, that's the underlying core of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. You mentioned that you took a course on drama and how to act in certain situations, and you're here holding a talk for us also about women in leadership and so on. Yet on the other hand, you mentioned, you know, assertiveness seminars for women aren't the only solution. What kind of events have you participated in or workshop have you taken, and what do you hold from the different kinds of things you can do, you know, to get a broader skill set as a woman in handling certain environments, and what do you hold of these kind of women networks in general?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'll address the point about the women's networks. I think they're really important. Studies show that actually for women, networking is not that helpful for you to get ahead in your career, but in my opinion, they're immensely helpful as a support network. Because if you're the only woman working in a very particular situation and you need some help, you know, I would often call on my female engineering buddies from the Australian Defence Force Academy, and it was so incredibly useful. So it didn't give me access to the inner sanctum of politics or this, that, the other, but it definitely helped. That I had friends who told me about credibility glasses and the various other things that they tried. So that's why these sorts of events I think are really important. Sorry, the other question was regarding what types of training and how to build those skills, right? So actually, you know what really helped me build my skills? I mean, I got a lot of training through the Defence Force, so that's where most of my training came, but the thing that really helped me was managing volunteers. They're not paid to be there. It's like herding cats. You know, I ran, you know, for about 5 years, I was the team manager for the airforce cross-country skiing and biathlon competition. There were politics galore. I learned a lot about politics just by throwing myself in there, you know, and making the most of it. And did I really know what I was doing? No. Even when I walked into my first leadership role, which was actually managing peers in an engineering design office, or people who'd been my peers the year before, I was terrified right up until the point where I actually did it, because even though I'd done all of these courses, it's not the same as having experience. So if you're not getting the experience in your actual work, go out and do some volunteer pursuits and try and get experience that way instead. I found that immensely helpful. As I said, I'm team manager for cross-country skiing and biathlon. I ran the entertainment. I was one of the co-chairs of the entertainment committee for our officers' mess, which was basically just means throwing lots of parties, but you know, it was great. And then I've run yoga retreats, you know, for the past, 5 years or more as well. So those sorts of activities I found really built my skill, but you also do want some theory in there. So just, find some good books and find some mentors that can talk to you about their experiences, or coaches, people within the circles that you trust and whose experience you look up to.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, and thank you for the presentation. I was just wondering how you deal with the first-hand impression that you have to give to people. I know that the first seconds is important, but also just the first week. I can tell for myself, my stereotype, I'm blonde, I'm stupid. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
not that you are, but the stereotype.
Yeah,
yes.
but it's just I've been abroad in the U.S. in mechanical engineering, and there was a lot of the guys that also study aerospace, and I really needed that. I had to prove myself. Like I could do something. I knew I was clever than them, and I really felt the need to prove myself. Do you do that too, or do you feel like you really have to be?
Well,
go in, or do you just?
Well, it depends on what you mean by prove yourself.
Like the first time.
Yeah, well, for some women, what I see them doing when they're trying to prove themselves is they take on a really masculine sort of way of doing it that is more based on subordinated cooperation, and it actually turns everybody off. How I prove myself is I just be myself as much as I possibly can. And that tends to win people over, because if you're candid, if you're genuine, you know, these sorts of traits, well, certainly not necessarily for management, they may or may not recognize it, but certainly for the people under you, I found that, you know, I get along really well with tradies. That's the Australian term for tradesmen, because I'm just very candid. That's their nature as well. I'm just very honest, you know, in the way that I speak to them about things, and very frank, and I don't hold back. And they really appreciate that, because they know that I'm not going to be playing games with them, and I'm really seeing them eye to eye, and I have compassion for their situation, and I see them for who they are. So that's how I deal with those sorts of situations. But you're right, in the beginning, there might be, you know, some stereotype around it. This, something that can help is what you wear. And if I actually paid quite a bit of money and went to an image consultant once I left the military, because the great thing about the military is they tell you what you wear. So, and it's a, you know, it's a military uniform. It sort of commands, ta-da, you know, all by itself, right? So I actually went and spoke with an image consultant who not only threw out half the orphan clothing in my wardrobe that didn't go with anything else, helped me to give the message that I wanted to give when I was in those sorts of situations on a really unconscious level, even if it's someone, you know, some tradesman who doesn't even understand the first thing about fashion, that there's just still something about your image that sends a certain message. So that's one thing that I would suggest. But ultimately, if you're going to be spending more than, you know, 5 minutes with the person, in time they're going to come to know you. And so the more genuine you are, you know, in that with that first impression, the better. They may not look at you and think, oh, there's the next general manager, but you know, that will come with time, particularly if you work out how the politics of the organisation work, and who, if you think you're better than your peers and you're not getting noticed, then who it is that you need to get the recognition from. There are other, you need to be politically savvy, you know, into the future.
Hi. You mentioned earlier the difference between being a manager and being the subject matter expert.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, when you chose for yourself that you wanted to follow a career in management,
Mm-hmm.
and also if it was a direct aim
Mm-hmm.
during your education, that was a goal of the education, that you were to become a manager.
Yeah, so being a military officer by definition means you are going to be a leader. So when I was 17, even though I was petrified at the idea of being a leader, I had somehow managed to convince them during the recruiting process that I would make a good leader. Sometimes I just want to, you know, on this point of sort of, you know, I guess courage around leadership, is sometimes you just have to put it on. You know, I know that sounds terrible, but you do. You just got to kind of suck it in, and you're scared, but look, just put on a happy face and do it and see what happens, because sometimes you'll even surprise yourself, you know. Yes, but so for me, the choice to be a leader was part of that initial part. But, you know, it was like I'd kind of got through the door, was walking, you know, down the hallway, and then realised, what am I doing? I'm a fraud. They're going to find me out. You know, I'm not really going to be a leader, which, of course, is completely incorrect, but it was just my own fears sort of taking control.
Hi, Satya. So as a leader, do you think that we as women have a benefit over men?
Have the benefit of women?
No, have a benefit over men that men don't have?
A benefit over men, you mean?
Yes.
Let me think. Well, I think it depends on the situation. In terms of templates, so what I found was being a young woman, it was very easy for me to tap into the daughter template. Yeah? Which has its pros and cons, you know. And, you know, it meant that, you know, the non-commissioned officers were initially a bit nicer to me because they often had daughters around my age, or maybe not that much younger. But then it's a question of how you kind of break out of that mold, you know, as well, and that you don't just get kind of fit into the timid female box. And my feeling on this is men and women need to develop their masculine and feminine selves. So as far as stereotypes go, feminine traits are more nurturing, cooperative, this type of thing. Masculine traits are more decisive and, you know, so forth. I think we all understand what that side of it is. So by developing both of those traits, then you can pull out whatever tool you need, you know, whenever you need it. And that's going to help. I found that helped me to break out of the daughter mold that some people had of me, you know, not being afraid to state, you know, what your opinion and what's important to you. But I'm trying to think if there's other ways that being a woman was helpful. You're not necessarily subject to the same pecking order. You're completely outside of it, which is also problematic because it means you can't access the inner sanctum either. But it also means you're not at the bottom of the pecking order necessarily, which can sometimes, you know, be helpful. You know, and it's also interesting. I just, you know, want to relay a short story. This same warrant officer that I had working for me, because a lot of people don't necessarily think about the differences of being a man versus a woman in certain contexts. Because, as I said earlier, I wake up in the morning and think I'm Satya, not I'm a female engineer or something like that. And anyway, he came up to me after maybe about 6 months into the job, and he said, "Women are different from men, aren't they?" And I said, "Oh, they're very observant." and I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, you know, it's summer and we've got the air conditioning on and you're always wearing a jumper. And in fact, a lot of the other women I've noticed are always like wearing something in their cold, and the rest of us men were like sweating." I'm like, yes. You know, like these are some of the way, like he probably had never considered that some of the women who were working for him in the past may have had some biological things going on that made a work environment less ergonomic for them than others. But, you know, that's a slide aside. You know, in regards to being a man versus woman, of course, it's got to be different in certain ways. But I think it swings and roundabouts. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's even, because until we see roughly, I have my rough guidance, which is not backed up by any studies whatsoever, but I kind of feel that until you get at least a 40-60 balance for gender, at least, there's still work to be done in terms of those structures and those social systems.
Thank you.
Hello, I just have a question. How old were you when you became an engineer? That's like initial.
So I was 17 when let me calculate this. So I was 17 when I went to the academy. That was 4 years, a 4-year engineering degree. So 20, then I spent 2 years flying, 3 years flying. So 24 by the time I changed back to become an engineer. But I was a little bit older as well. Actually, most of my peers, they were out, you know, managing people in their mid-40s by the time they were 21.
Okay, the reason that I just asked that question was because I, together with Line, are doing this blog called Kant Fremtiden, which means kind of master of the future, about female engineers. And we've had in the discussion blog a lot of guys actually saying that you shouldn't try to basically have more people become engineers, because the ones who are supposed to be engineers, they have always been engineers. They kind of, you know, they know when they're kids that that's the profession they have to be in.
Gotcha.
And then I was arguing against that because I don't think that's always the case. But I would like to hear your view on this.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I don't. It's all well and good to say that, you know, some people want to be engineers since they were children, but you know, and that's great. But people change their minds, you know, and as we unfold as human beings, and we learn more about our skills and whatnot, you know, life is going to take us on different journeys. So what, we should close off opportunities to people because they didn't think about it since they were children? Yeah, you know, I think, you know, it's a... It has the potential, that type of perspective has the potential to shut down the innovation within a group of people. You know, you need fresh blood coming through. You need fresh perspectives coming through. You know, some people have become engineers much later on in life, having gone through some big transition. Some people have left engineering and gone off and, I don't know, I've got friends who went off and became doctors, you know. So who's to say that just because we didn't know exactly what we wanted to do when we were in our late teens or early teens making those choices in our subjects at school, that should like shut off, that should determine our trajectory for the rest of life. No, I'm with you.
Hello. Working in a men's world, I often realize or experience that when I meet another woman, she'll be very helpful because we are both women. And I tend to do the same. But sometimes we also see that women are women's largest enemies. So do you think that's a factor that explains why so few women are in the board of directors, so on?
That's a good question. You know, certainly like when I look at my experience in the military, and some of the things that we were taught as we were going through at various women in engineering events, they said that there was a tendency for some of the front runner women they basically, what I understand now is they took on the subordinated cooperation perspective and did this to get to where they want to go, and the next woman coming up is a threat to my position because it's me and the boys, not them and the boys, you know. And so I feel that I hope that as more and more generations come through, that we have more compassion and less competitiveness with these types of things and instead support each other. I mean, that's just a general shift anyway from the subordinated cooperation perspective across to something that's more based on coordinated cooperation. So yes, unfortunately, I think it's true, particularly for the front runners in any industry or in any organisation, but I don't think it ought to be that way. And I think there's a lot of evidence that a lot of women do know how to work collaboratively, and I find that if you're in a majority women situation, that's when it gets bitchy. If you're in majority men situation, you're dealing with the pecking order and, you know, being put one up, one down, that type of thing. But when you've got a gender balance, I feel that you start to enter a space where it helps to remove some of those issues that exist. So, you know, keep that in mind as you rise through the ranks to CEO, not to step on the women behind you, but rather to help the other women through, because it's going to make everybody's life, you know, better.
Hello. Well, I think actually relates to the previous question, but I think you mentioned quotes as a part of the homosocial reproducibility problem, as a part of the solution, I suppose, as I got it. But if we had, well, let's hypothesize more women in managers,
then there wouldn't be the need.
Positions, but wouldn't that happen just the other way around, like women favorizing women?
Sorry, it wouldn't help. Say
like
that again.
Women just doing the same as men do right now, like in your example?
Well, the thing is, you don't need quotas if you've got a gender balance. That's the point. Well, and if you're confident that the underlying systems aren't going to revert it back to a, like something that is out of balance. So once you've got, close to a 50-50 balance, the need for some of these other systems can probably tend to come away. It depends on the situation, it depends on the context. Because you're right, you don't want it to necessarily go this way either. That can be equally problematic, which is why this idea of coordinated cooperation, it's not about women dominating the world, but it is about us having a fair go, which isn't currently the case in most places. But I think your point is that quotas need to be switched off at some point. Is that?
No, I was just wondering if women would do the same as men do in your example. Yeah.
Could women, dominate men, and if it went the other direction?
No, it was more like, well, you said you had a colleague that was.
Oh right, okay, yeah. He got an education.
Just the other way around.
Yeah.
There were mostly women in the board of managers.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, on the whole, he was fine. I mean, we're friends, and I took him hiking recently, and things like that. And we were nice to him. Like we weren't nasty to him or anything like that. And likewise, like I've worked with where I've been the only woman with a bunch of guys, so I really enjoy working with. Like there wasn't any real animosity. It's more just the broader systems. That's where some of the inequalities exist. So in that particular situation, it wasn't that we started like beating on him or anything like that. And the other thing to bear in mind is that ultimately the engineering system itself is one that has been dominated by men for so many years that 3 or 4 women in an engineering office with one guy is not going to immediately reverse that, overnight. But he did learn a lot about women's problems. Oh, sorry, yes. Yeah. I think you would tend to find that. Yeah, that would be the case because, which is why we need to be conscious of it. We can't say, oh, just because I'm a woman, I'm not going to engage in homosocial reproduction. No, you're probably going to do it on not only the basis of your gender, but the basis of your race, the basis of your religion, perhaps even your age, a whole bunch of things. Yeah, we have to be conscious of that all the time.
Just to continue that, there have been studies showing that right now, women do not do the homosocial reproduction for women. They continue in the culture where they promote men. So when a woman gets in and gets promoted and get a management position, she tends to have a specialized for the men and not the women.
That's interesting.
And that is really interesting.
Is that just within the engineering? Because I'm wondering if nurses and things like that.
It's general
really?
in management and promoting women in management, that women and all other minorities actually have to keep in mind that I am in a position right now where I can promote other minorities like me or other minorities in general, and not promoting the majority, which is, especially in Denmark, are white men.
And I would think that they're the women who are on the wrong side of history, which is, and obviously not every woman in a management position is going to have that kind of attitude, but it's all the more reason why we need to not do that. Because they're obviously still working from the subordinated cooperation frame, well.
We have to be aware of what the culture is and how we are going to change it or play by it.
Yes.
Or
well, I mean, and that's a good point too, is that, you have to learn how to play the game, but then you also have to know when to stop playing the game. So, for example, Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, talks very much about, women stepping in and playing the game, basically. But frankly speaking, I don't like the game. So I'm happy to lean in to get to a point where I can then make changes, but I don't necessarily fundamentally agree with, with all those things anyway. Yeah.
Just to quickly jump in the lean in thing. Working, I tend to, or I think in general, you try to copy people. Sometimes it happens unconsciously, sometimes it happens on purpose because you would like to reach a certain career step. Where do you, as you say, where do you lean back? Where do you cut the balance between, okay, how far do I get and how much maybe my personality changes unconsciously? How much do I turn into maybe one of those career people that
step on people?
Social? Exactly, step on other people.
Yeah.
And maybe that also reflects your private life. I mean, how is there a way of
it's a great question. It's a great question. For me, what I do is I'm very clear on what my ethics are. And, you know, I subscribe to a philosophy called neo-humanism. And what this means is the idea that it's based on an ethic of universal love and the idea that we are all equal in some way. We all come from that same consciousness in some way. And when you have these sorts of perspectives, you are probably at some point, I mean, I was a vegetarian yogi in the military. At some point, there was going to be a disconnect between what I thought and what was going on around me. I stuck with what I thought. You know, yeah, there were some things that I took on, like, you know, I was this kind of gangly 17-year-old girl who had to learn how to stand with command presence or whatever. But I think you've got to fundamentally decide what is going against my personal ethics and what isn't. And if it is, then you've got to have the moral courage to stand up for what you believe and to treat people in a way that you actually believe in treating people, even if it goes against the grain. Maybe not be absolute about that. You know, if you've got a mortgage and, you know, doing that might mean the end of your career, you have to play it a bit more safe, but typically speaking.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah, so thanks for the great talk. And I was thinking, how do you keep yourself motivated when you kind of have the odds against you, when you can see your peers, because they are male, you know, have an advantage compared to you?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I was lucky being in the military because, as odd as it may sound, there was a lot less discrimination than there is in industry. The pay was transparent, and I knew that I was getting paid exactly the same as my peers. The civil engineers in Air Force, for example, it was 40% women. So, you know, great maternity benefits, you know, like all of these, all these sorts of things. But, you know, certainly when I look around at some of my peers who weren't, you know, typically they weren't necessarily in the Air Force, I guess. In some of those situations, they just had to move on from the job. You know, if it was that problematic, go find a job with someone who's actually going to respect you. Easier said than done, of course. The other side of it too is understanding, okay, to what extent do I have a sphere of influence here where I can maybe shift things? And that's where you need to learn how to play the political game as well and get connections with people in places who you know are going to support you. So for example, a friend of mine who works in Silicon Valley, she noticed that her boss would talk to the guys about work and tasking and that type of thing, and he would only ever talk to her about children. And it's like, what does that say about your values? What, that women are only there for looking after... She never said this to him, obviously. You know, that women are only for looking after children. But that was the subtle message that was coming through. And he would do some really outrageous things, which I won't even go into. I think for a lot of women, motivation is really difficult because it's like, oh, do I go to the effort of doing something about this? She had contacts in other places in the organisation that could have resolved some of the issues that she was facing. But in the end, you know, she was pregnant and, you know, she was going to be off work at some point and, oh, whatever, I'm just going to put it all behind me. You know, I had a conversation with her about this and I said, you do realise, though, that if you had have taken the opportunity to do something about it, you would be making life a lot easier for all the other women behind you. Because I think as women, we tend to not do things for ourselves. You know, culturally, we're sort of brought up to think about others. I mean, we do that to varying extents, and it's not to say that women are always thinking about others more than men. That's certainly not the case. But we have to undo some of that conditioning, or if nothing else, think of it from a service point of view, and that is that if I'm doing this not for myself, but for every other woman that's going to walk in my shoes behind me. You know, and that's the pioneer aspect of it.
I think we need to stop here. Thank you very much for coming, Satya.
Thank you all.